Awesome. Well, thanks, Jason. My name is Kelly Vierck, and like Jason said, I'm the new UT Meets Extension Specialist. And so, a little bit about me before we get started. I have a dual appointment in Extension and Teaching. And so, I have a 70% appointment in Animal Science with a 30% appointment in Food Science because, as we all know, meat is one of those things that kind of runs the fence line between the live animal and food because meat is an animal that does become a food. And so I'm really fortunate to be able to work with both sides of the fence, as I like to say. And so that nothing really shows that more than my topic that Jason and Chris wanted me to talk about tonight. And so that's home meat processing and storage. And so when we talk about this, we can approach this from a couple of different ways. And so I am going to cover all of our major species. So beef, pork, lamb, and poultry. They're kind of grouped together by red meat versus poultry. And I will be honest, I'm telling on myself a bit. I consider myself an expert of the hooves and the hides. Feathers are not quite my thing, but I do know enough to be dangerous. So we'll talk about poultry just a little bit as well. And so I'm going to cover a couple different topics, but starting with at-home cutting trips, tips and tricks, best practices with cuts and fabrication, and some suggestions for you guys to go ahead and pull out in terms of processing, and then also storage and preservation options for you as well. And so my big three major rules when it comes to meat processing at home is to keep it clean, keep it cold, and keep it safe. And so by following these three rules, you're going to get safe product that you can consume that is wholesome, but also not have any detriment to your quality. And so, of course, when you're trying to process at home, it's not going to be, you know, as good as in a facility that's chilled and has temperature control and things like that. But I understand the local approach where folks are wanting to know exactly where their food comes from and really kind of try to control the ingredients and things like that. And so the first part is to keep this clean. And so this is always the number one rule is to wash your hands throughout the process and to keep it clean. And so part of that is having access to clean, potable water. You want to make sure that you're using food safe materials as well when you're going ahead and harvesting or processing animals for your own use. And so that includes sanitizing and making sure that everything's sanitized before you start and between products as well, especially if you're planning on breaking down whole birds is one thing that I see quite a bit, but salmonella is no one's friend. And so we want to make sure that we're keeping it clean. That might be using gloves, depending on what part of the harvest process that you're in. And so, in addition to that, you can also have multiple cutting boards, knives, and other processing equipment handy because you may need to switch between knives, especially if you're removing hides or things like that. And so making sure that you have multiple ones available can really help with that as well. Excuse me. One big thing that they're pretty low price, but from a food safety standpoint, knife sterilizers, especially if you're going to be doing some of those larger livestock species, are very helpful between harvest and fabrication for keeping those knives sanitized. And so what they are basically stainless steel boxes that keep water at 180 degrees. And so you can dip your knife in and help keep that sanitized. It's really helpful during the skinning or the dehiding process. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Um, Another part to this is if you are processing at home, especially if you are starting with the harvest process and carrying that all the way through, using a clean, dry, dust-free area that is well drained is going to be very important because especially if you're harvesting a pig or a steer, there's a lot of bodily fluids that come out. There's a lot of blood that comes out. And so having that good drainage option is going to be really important as well. I also, this is just my personal preference, but I also suggest shade if you can get that, especially if you're trying to do this during the summertime. I moved here in June. That was a poor decision. The humidity in Tennessee can really take a toll, and so having shade or even pop-up tents and things like that are another option to help keep things dry, keep things out of the product. Because if you're working near a tree, leaves come off. And so just trying to maintain that process and keeping it really clean. The next biggest thing is temperature control. And so keeping it cold, having ice, especially potable ice, is going to be very important to making sure that your product chills properly and stays cold from a food safety aspect. Because we might not have access to refrigeration or freezers right away, and we want to immediately submerge those things, especially when we're talking about chicken carcasses. You can submerge them into cold water or ice baths and really help chill those birds down really rapidly. Um, and if you're from where I'm from originally, I'm originally from the great state of Wisconsin. We use the outdoors as a freezer sometimes when it comes to that. Sometimes you leave the beer out and then it explodes. But, it still works in terms of temperature control and things like that. We might not get that cold here in Tennessee, but it's still something to think about as well. And so, what we're doing with chill steps is making sure that we are going to reduce the ability for microorganisms to grow. They like to grow at room temperature. There are certain categories that can survive at colder temperatures, but they don't really thrive in colder temperatures. They're much like humans from that regard. But the closer we keep it to room temperature, the more likely that we're going to have microorganism growth. And like I said, salmonella is a bad day. E. coli is even worse. And nobody wants listeria either. So we want to keep it as cold as possible. And we can also keep things separated. I always suggest Ziplocs or plastic bags if you want to keep products separate from the ice. Because if you do leave product on top of the ice, you can see some discoloration as myoglobin leaves with the water. And myoglobin, for those of you that don't know, is the pigment that gives meat its color. And so it's water soluble and it can come out sometimes if meat is stored directly on top of ice with no separation. Keep it safe. Okay. I always joke that joke, but am serious about it. I want people to leave with the same amount of fingers that they came in with. And that should be your goal as well for at home processing, because I know some of you are going to roll your eyes when I say this, but knives are sharp. Keep yourself safe. Um, the last thing you want to do on a processing day is have somebody lose a thumb or a finger and have to go rescue that and delay your processing because you have to take a trip to the emergency room, and nobody wants that. And so making sure that your knives are sharp, um, because sharper knives are safer than duller knives. They're going to do less damage. And cutting away from your body is going to be important. You don't want to ever bring that knife towards you, unless, well, just a good rule of thumb is not to bring it towards you, and to make sure that you're wearing Kevlar or no cut gloves on your opposite cutting hand. So if you cut with your right hand, have a no cut glove on your left hand, as well as Kevlar aprons or no cut aprons. They're really helpful to making sure you don't cut any of those important parts um, if you do happen to bring that knife towards you. And in addition to that, if you are using electricity, please, well, most of y'all probably will, especially if you're harvesting larger livestock, making sure you have a safe, grounded source of electricity. Um, Nobody wants to get electrocuted on the harvest floor, and nobody wants to get carbon monoxide poisoning. So if you are using a generator, make sure that you're using it with the accordance for outside specifications, because again, carbon monoxide, bad time. Salmonella, bad time. And so those are just my three general rules of thumb before we get started and really get into this. So some equipment to have on hand, different types of knives. So we have breaking, boning, skinning knives. And so this picture here on the far right hand side on the top, we've got the knives with the three black handles. The top one of those is an example of what a boning knife would look like. And then we also have two skinning knives there as well. Breaking knives are generally going to be 10 inches or longer in length. And so we use those to break between subprimals, um, especially when we have a separation between the rib and the loin is a large separation. Um, and especially in lambs as well, when we're separating the rib from the loin there. If we rib our carcasses, which in the case of at-home processing, we probably wouldn't rib those. But a breaking knife is also helpful in that situation. Knife scabbards, I have a picture of this one here on the side. Those are just guards that hold your knives. A lot of the time, we'll use either plastic chain or metal chain and basically hang those on our hips when we're processing, but they keep the knives safe and in an orderly fashion and close at hand when you're going to go ahead and process those. Knife steels and sharpeners are also very helpful to have on hand to make sure that your blades stay honed. Again, we want to keep a nice sharp knife. It's a lot easier from the ergonomic standpoint, but also it's a lot safer and makes a cleaner cut if you do happen to cut yourself. When it comes to our larger livestock species, especially once we talk about carcass breakdown, hand saws are going to be incredibly important. You can also, I've seen some at-home processors or mobile processors use a Sawzall, which also works very well if you're looking at breaking a sternum or um, breaking or doing that initial split on a beef carcass as well, just kind of depending on that. I've seen some different processing facilities use those, and as long as you keep them clean and only use them for meat processing, you should be good to go. I don't want anybody cutting wood with a Sawzall and then bringing it to your at-home processing day. From a poultry standpoint, to restrain the birds and during exsanguination, killing cones are a great example of a restrainment for poultry, and I have a picture of that later on in the slides. If you are doing larger livestock, stunning is required by the Humane Slaughter Act, but also it makes things a lot easier when you're processing animals. And so a stunning device that could be a captive bolt, that could be a firearm. It just kind of depends on what you're harvesting, and we'll talk about that more later on. Having access to a gambrel, ropes, or chains to help suspend that animal during the bleeding process. Of course, not the gambrel is helpful for poultry, but the ropes and the chain are not necessary if you're harvesting birds. But again, if you're harvesting your larger livestock, such as our red meat species, it's going to be helpful to have those. Buckets for water, buckets for ice, buckets for cleaning solutions. So having plenty of those on hand. If you are harvesting those larger livestock species, I skipped over the chain hoist. If you have access to a chain hoist or a tractor or something that you can lift that animal up with, it really expedites the bleeding process. And so I highly recommend you having access to that as well. Just a couple things that I already touched on: Kevlar no-cut gloves and other PPE equipment, ample clean water, towels, and coolers and ice are all going to be very important during this process. And so when we think about on-farm harvest tips, we want to take livestock off of feed at least 12 hours prior to harvest. And this goes for all species. Doesn't matter if we're talking poultry, beef, pork, lamb, take them off of feed. Now, I didn't say take them off water. They can have plenty of access to water for that last 12 hours before you process those animals because it helps with bleeding. And so making sure that those animals are hydrated is going to be important from that aspect. But take them off of feed because of the issues that we can have with evisceration. And I'll talk about those more in a little bit. And so I'm first going to walk through our major harvest steps when we talk about beef, pork, and lamb. And these are pretty condensed. I have some YouTube videos in here as well. I'm pretty restricted on what I can do in a webinar. There's only so much that I can do, show. I'm pretty sure I'm going to wind up on a government watch list after all the things that I've been Googling for pictures for you guys, so I hope you appreciate them. I'm pretty sure my FBI agent is really questioning what I've been Googling here lately. So, when we talk about our processing steps for our larger livestock species, so beef, pork, and lamb, restraint is going to be important because, as everybody knows, these animals, especially our hogs and our steers, will outweigh us, especially steers. And so having access to a good restraint, whether that be, I hope you have access to a chute or something like that, or at least a head catch where you can catch that animal in a restraint to make it easier to go ahead and dispatch that animal. Um, Hogs can be done with a snare. It's very challenging, but it can be done. Lambs in general is going to be more challenging and probably will require a halter restraint to make sure that that animal doesn't struggle, because making sure that you get an accurate stun is probably one of the most important things in this entire process. And so when it comes to stunning, stunning is going to render that animal unconscious. There are several methods that are approved, and so some of these are approved by animal welfare organizations as well as beef quality assurance, and so that's where a lot of these are from. My suggestion is a penetrative penetrative um, captive bolt, which goes into the brain. But probably the most common that we see with on-home processing is a gunshot, using a firearm to go ahead and stun that animal. I never thought I'd have to say this, but don't use a hollow point or anything that fragments in terms of those type of bullets. I've had to explain why you can't use a hollow point in a lamb's head. Unfortunately, you're not going to have very much head left if you're using a hollow point with a sheep. And same thing with cattle or hogs. So I do not recommend, and none of the animal welfare guidelines recommend using a hollow point, fragmenting bullets, or a BB. Um, I've heard people try it, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but the reason we have these guidelines is because people have tried it in the past. And so, just general guidelines with that, you should be within 3 feet of an animal to avoid ricochet if you're using a firearm, especially a pistol. Um, it just kind of depends on that. And so, when we do a proper stun, we're going to shoot for just above the eyes. We're not shooting between the eyes. The most easy place to get a proper stun is going to be slightly above the eyes in the center of the forehead. And so you can kind of draw that X in the center of their forehead, and then you're going to go at a downward angle to go ahead and dispatch that animal. And so that goes for any of our major harvest species. It's also approved if in case you need to do euthanasia with a horse as well, there is that option as well. In addition to that, making sure that a proper stun has been applied. And so we can tell a proper stun has been applied through a couple of different methods. The first thing is if that animal is stunned properly, that animal should collapse immediately with no attempt to right itself. So when we harvest animals in a facility, especially in a chute, that animal's going to drop straight down. And there's not going to be any movement or attempt of that animal to get up. If it does attempt to get up, it was probably misstunned, and then should try to repeat the stun. In addition to that, checking for rhythmic breathing, there may be some random gasps of air that does occur during those final moments pre-mortem, but we're looking for rhythmic breathing. And so you would see the abdominal cavity start to move. If you see livestock take a breath, and they're using their abdominal cavity, that is an example of rhythmic breathing. There should be no vocalization as well. That animal should not be able to make a noise. And if you go up to that animal and touch it on its eye directly, it should not blink. And its head should be laying pretty limp in terms of that. There is some movement, though, that's pretty normal post-mortem, and we see this pretty often when we're harvesting animals because of the chemistry that's going on within the muscle tissue itself. And so you can see rapid kicking of the front or the back legs. And so it's going to be a rapid kind of like stab at the air. And that's normal. And so what the body's trying to do is use up its last nerve impulses and energy for that muscle. And so there is going to be slight kicks. And so as you're going to chain them up and hoist them out to bleed them, you may um, encounter some kicking. And so just be really careful when you're trying to do that, especially when we're talking about steers. The next step is going to be exsanguination. I probably should have warned people these slides are going to be a little bit graphic from here on out. But I did find these really great pictures from Purdue in terms of hog exsanguination from this. And so once we get that animal stunned, whether we're using a captive bolt or we're using a firearm, we want to immediately exsanguinate this animal. Not only is it the humane thing to do, but also from a meat quality standpoint, we want to make sure that we don't have any issues like fiery fat or blood splash that come from small pinpoint hemorrhages during an extended stun to stick time. And so you want to use a relatively long knife. So they're using a boning knife in this photo. And so you want to make an incision basically through the dewlap immediately in front of the breastbone. And so I know pigs are a little bit weird when it comes to that. And so that's why I found a hog photo. And basically you're going to make that incision and move up. And that's going to allow for the carotid artery and the jugular vein to be severed, which are our goals when we're harvesting animals. From there, depending on how you want to process your animals, there's an option for scalding for hogs. but there's also dehairing, skinning, and hide removal. And I have some great YouTube videos from the Bearded Butchers. If you don't follow them and you're interested in processing, I highly recommend it. They have a great social media page with some really great how-tos in terms of breaking down carcasses, harvesting animals, and so they have a great one for skinning and hide removal for both hogs and cattle. And I'm restricted in terms of time, so I want to make sure that I can get through everything. But I do have these YouTube links, and I will send my slides to Jason and Chris. So if you're interested, you can have access to those as well. From there, we have evisceration, and so that's going to be the removal of those internal organs. And so in that case, um, I have a suggestion to use the handsaw to separate that sternum. It makes it a lot easier to remove, especially the heart and the lungs of cattle. Um, one time when we were harvesting at the meat lab, I was at Arkansas for 5 years prior to this position at UT, and I was trying to get what we call the pluck out. It's the lungs and the heart of a steer. And I'm digging, I'm trying to get it out. And I was like, why am I having so much issue? And then I noticed that the sternum hadn't been split. And so splitting that is going to be really helpful when you make that. But the first cut that you make is going to be starting up basically from the cod of a steer or an udder if you're harvesting a heifer. And so my big suggestion with that is to make sure that when you do that knife movement, um, if you're using a boning knife or anything that's really long, I would suggest to hold that knife. This is the one time that I suggest you point the knife towards yourself, because if you go in blind, especially if you're harvesting ruminants, we want to make sure that that knife points outward. We don't want a busted gut. We don't want a busted rumen or a busted stomach, because that is a major food safety contamination. And so we want to make sure that we don't do that. And so as you go down the midline of that animal, pointing that knife out rather than in, to avoid that. And so um, we don't want to contaminate with rumen fluids or stomach contents if we're harvesting hogs. And so you're going to remove all the internal organs. So that includes repro, that includes your GI tract, your lungs, your liver, your kidneys. All of that is going to come out in your major EVIS steps. And so depending on how you do it and depending on your setup, having a gut buggy or a gut bucket is going to be really helpful. One way that I've seen it, especially for cattle, because I know every time I harvest cattle, I underestimate how big that viscera is. And so people use a stock tank, one of those big plastic ones, and so they can just drop it straight in during the EVIS process to separate that out. And one big portion that I always suggest with this is to make sure that you have a plan for your offal. That's going to be your EVIS, that's going to be oxtail and things like that. It could be your hides as well. How are you saving them for consumption? Are you going to save those hides to be tanned? Have a plan in place before you get started. And so Tennessee has laws in place, and the options that you have for offal and dead animals are the same. And so generally it's going to be rendering, composting, incineration, or burial. And so making sure that you follow those Tennessee state guidelines, because nobody wants to get in trouble for contaminating groundwater. So making sure that you're following those guidelines set out by the state of Tennessee. The last step is going to be splitting for beef and pork. Generally, we don't split lamb carcasses. They're not big enough to go ahead and do that. Doing a final rinse and making sure that everything is sprayed off. I also suggest using a 5% solution of vinegar in one of those pump lawn sprayers. And that just adds an extra layer of protection um, from microorganisms, because it does act as a natural acid to go ahead and break those down. And then, of course, getting things chilled rapidly, is very important to the success of your products. And so we want to make sure that, especially for our larger animals, that we can get them cooled to 45 degrees or less within 24 hours prior to harvest or after harvest. You're not going to chill them before harvest. I apologize for that. And so poultry is very similar. It's just a lot easier because it's a lot smaller, and you can do a lot more in one day. And so the first part of this, again, is going to be restraint. And so this picture right here that I have is an example of a killing comb. You can also, I found out today, make them from 5 gallon buckets. And so you can break the bucket and kind of twist it into the shape. And they recommend putting this on something that can easily be rinsed off because you will be dispatching the birds in there as well. So trees, posts, things like that are easy to clean are always a good suggestion. Um, there are a couple different ways that we can go ahead and dispatch birds. And I say dispatch because most of the time with backyard poultry processing, we're going to skip the step of stunning because we can immediately kill these animals a lot easier than livestock species, and we can jump right to the exsanguination. Um, Depending on how you dispatch your birds, you do not need to add an extra bleeding step on there. Um, the big one with that would be a cervical dislocation. So if you decide to, um, which is a fancy way to say you're breaking that bird's neck, you will have to add that exsanguination step in. And so if you do a neck cut or a decapitation, um, we're going to start the exsanguination process immediately right after that. And so allowing those birds time to bleed prior to breaking them down, plucking them, and all those other fun steps that come along with this is also going to be important as well. Something that we have with birds that we don't necessarily have with our other livestock species of, course, the feathers. And so getting rid of those feathers requires a lot of potable water, hot water to go ahead and make sure that those feathers come out easy. You can hand pluck them. I don't recommend it because that takes a long time. If you can find access or rent a plucker, excuse me, it helps get the feathers off a lot easier and faster. And so being able to rent one of those or borrow from another homesteading group is always really helpful to do that. And then, of course, you have evisceration, which is the same thing when we talk about our livestock species. It's the removal of the internal organs. And then a final rinse, again, I recommend with at least 5% vinegar, and then chilling those birds. The nice thing about harvesting poultry, especially, we can drop those birds in a cooler with ice and ice water and get that temperature down relatively quickly. But one thing I always joke with my other producers is don't forget the birds in the cooler, because then you'll have some quality issues if you let them sit in the cooler water too long. And there's also some food safety issues there as well. So now that we're through the harvesting process and now we have um, our products and we're wanting to break them down into steaks and portion them into different things. And so um, now we got past harvest, now what? So generally, especially if you're harvesting your own livestock, we're going to break down from a carcass into what we call subprimals or wholesale cuts. And so just breaking them down into smaller parts to make it easier to cut retail cuts out of, or if you're looking to make ground beef and things like that. And it just makes it easier to parse them out when we break them down into subprimals. And so the beef has the major subprimals of the chuck, the rib, the loin is the full loin, excuse me, is the short loin with the sirloin attached to it, the round, and then we also have other primals of the brisket, plate, flank, and shank, to break those into. We also have out of pork. Pork is probably one of the easier species to break down. We have the Boston butt and the picnic shoulder. Those are both the shoulder. It just depends on where you split those. If you are like me and a big fan of pulled pork, Boston butts are great for that. They're a little bit fatter cut, but they hold up to the smoker really well. And the picnic shoulder can also be used for that as well. In pigs, we don't have a rib. Everything comes into the loin. We also have the belly, which is important for bacon production because that is where we're going to pull bacon from. And then the ham as well as the shanks as well. And finally, for lambs, a lamb is kind of a little bit of both worlds when it comes to this. And so we have the shoulder, the rack, the loin, the leg, the breast, and the foreshank in terms of this. The nice thing is if you're doing at-home processing, you can choose exactly what cuts you pull out of these. You can choose what cuts you turn into grind. It's all dependent on that. One of the things that I suggest is if you are doing at-home processing is to go to a Cabela's or another sporting goods store and get one of their tabletop grinders. I highly recommend those for making sausage, ground beef, ground sausage, all of those things. It just makes things a lot easier from that standpoint. Some of them also have combination mixer grinders, which are really helpful if you're making a fresh sausage blend, in terms of that. And we'll talk about poultry at the end of this section. And so when we have beef carcass fabrication, and so if you're really looking to get into this and what my cut suggestions are, we have to first talk about the function of these muscles. And so when it comes to this, our shoulder, so our chuck and our round, which is our hindquarter, are our locomotive muscles. They do a lot of the work when it comes to animal movement, because if you've ever seen a calf get up, walk around, they always use the front and the back legs to do it. And so they're more dense in terms of connective tissue, which makes it a little bit harder to break those down. In addition, I swear every time I break down a chuck, it's got 11 billion muscles and there's more that appear each time. I know it's not the truth, but sometimes it feels that way because the chuck, especially with the shoulder blade and how that shoulder moves, have a lot of muscles right around that area. That makes it challenging. And so the problem with these muscles, and really it's not a problem, but there's more connective tissue, they have larger fiber sizes, and can be kind of inconsistent when it comes to tenderness from those. The big ones and the ones that everybody wants are our support muscles. And so these are muscles that run along the backside of an animal that, and I'm talking about cattle here, but this really applies to any livestock species that we're talking about, with the exception of poultry, because they don't really have a top line when we think about it in comparison to our regular livestock species. But these are what I like to call the lazy muscles. And so these muscles sit on top of a steer. They have a very important job of making sure that that animal's spine stays straight. Very important. But it's not really hard because we don't expect that to happen and we have the spinal cord to help with that. And so these are really tender muscles that don't do a whole lot of work. They have smaller fiber sizes. Generally, they're going to be more marbled. And so that's why if you think about beef at the grocery store, I know this is an at-home processing, but our high dollar cuts are going to come out of what we call these middle meats. This is where ribeye steaks come from, tenderloin steaks, as well as New York City and Kansas City strip steaks, which, spoiler alert, is the same cut. It just depends on what coast you're marketing those to. And so I like to say, I hate the saying, but it's very true. There are 1,000 ways to skin a cat. There are 1,000 ways to fabricate a beef carcass. The cuts that I suggest tonight might not work for you or your family. Maybe you're more of a roast family. Maybe you're more of a ground beef family. Maybe you're harvesting a cold cow instead of a more of a fed steer situation. It just really depends on what works best for you. These are just my suggestions, though. When we're talking about cuts out of the chuck and round, they're really successful as roasts. If your family is a big crock pot family and you like the pot roast, you like things like that, highly recommend turning these cuts into roasts versus steaks. There are some exceptions to that out of the chuck, and I'll detail those in a hot second. But generally, these are going to be more successful as roast, cook low and slow. The opposite is true for the rib, loin, and sirloin. That's where our high quality steaks are going to come from. They're more successful with dry heat cookery methods like a grill or a flat top or a George Foreman. Charcoal grill doesn't really kind of matter in terms of that, but those are generally I suggest to leave as steaks. And sometimes even our cold cows surprise us in terms of marbling and have quality steaks that you can consume. So out of the chuck, one of the things that I really suggest, especially if you're a roast family, is to pull arm pot roast or seven bone roast. And so these depend on where you're going to pull them from. And so the arm pot roast is going to come from the front forelimb. The seven bone roast is going to come from right around the shoulder blade. And so we can see actually that blade bone right here that makes that seven shape. Of course, you want to pull the briskets out. I don't know anybody who doesn't like a good brisket on the smoker or anything like that. They freeze beautifully, they hold really well. And so I really always suggest brisket. There's also some steaks that you can pull out that come actually out of the seven bone roast. So you may have to sacrifice some pot roast if you're looking for some of these higher quality steaks that do come out of the chuck. One that I'm going to tell anybody to pull out of a chuck roll is going to be this chuck eye steak. It's also known as a poor man's ribeye or a Delmonico steak. And so it has the same muscles as a ribeye. It's just about half the size, and it's a really good portion size if you don't want a huge steak, but you're still craving one. In addition to that, you can fabricate short ribs out of the edge of the chuck. Um, we do have some ribs in there, so we have up until the fourth rib in a chuck, and so you do have the option to pull those out as well. The Denver steak is one that's pretty hidden. It's right here. We call it the chuck underblade, and so it just slides right underneath the shoulder blade, and it's very heavily marbled. It's a beautiful muscle if you're looking for a great steak um, that hides in the chuck. The flat iron steak is one of those that we talk about as a very huge success story from NCBA in terms of innovative cuts. This muscle right here actually sits right down here on the edge of the seven bone roast. And you can see from this photo that there's a big, thick band of connective tissue that runs through it when we cut it cross-section wise. Well, what researchers found out is if you fillet it like a fish, okay, and you pull the top layer off, you pull that band of connective tissue out, you can go ahead and portion it into these different more square shaped steaks. And so they're really popular as a breakfast steak, especially at some of our resorts and more food service institutions. I highly recommend those. Every chance I can find them for a meat judging contest, I like to pull those because after we're done with the contest and we get to grill those steaks up, they're really good. Um, oops, let me go back for a second. So there was one cut on here that I do not recommend unless you're going to chuck it straight head first, swan dive it straight into the grinder. And that is this mock tender roast right here. It likes, we hear the saying, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. This thing kind of quacks like a duck. It kind of looks like a duck, but it is not a duck. And the cut that it tries to imitate is the tenderloin. It's shaped like it. It has the band of connective tissue over it like it, but it also has connective tissue throughout the cut. And the only way to make it tender is to use blades to do it through the grinding process. And so I always recommend to use that one as lean grind. It works really well in that perspective, but I would not make a roast out of it. I would not make a steak out of it because it's going to wind up tasting like the bottom of your boot. Unfortunately, that is one that's kind of a clinker muscle, and I always like to warn people out of the chuck when it comes to that one. The rib is pretty simple. You're going to go ahead and make that separation between the fourth and the fifth ribs, and then the 12th and the 13th rib, and that is your rib. And there's really not a ton of things that you can do with that. Basically, you can cut it into steaks or cut it into prime rib roast. And so in that particular section, um, basically you can cut it into steaks, and how many steaks you get is dictated by the thickness that you go ahead and cut those. And so you can leave these bone in or you can leave them boneless. In the case of more at-home processing, tomahawk steaks are probably not going to be a thing unless you want to really impress the neighbors or something. But generally, cutting this into steaks is going to be the most successful way to do this. I lost my clicker there for a second. The loin is pretty much choose your own adventure when it comes to this. A word of caution though, if you are harvesting animals over 30 months of age, so that would be some of your maybe older heifers that didn't quite make the cut if you're keeping heifers or retaining heifers, or this might be your cold cow situation. Um, when it comes to animals over 30 months of age, we need to debone that product because of potential issues with the vertebral column. Generally, those animals that are over 30 months of age can be more susceptible to BSE or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also known as mad cow disease. And so I highly suggest deboning these cuts that have any of the vertebrae in them if your animal is over 30 months of age. With that note being said, if your animal is a typical fed steer age, so under 30 months of age, we can start with a beef short loin and then go ahead and break it into a porterhouse or a T-bone steak. And so that just depends on what portion of the short loin that it comes from. The closer you get to the hip of that animal, the more porterhouse that steak is going to become. The closer you get to the head of that animal, the more closer the T-bone steak is going to be because that tenderloin muscle starts really small on the rib and then gets to its biggest point at that hip, which is where the beef short loin is going to be removed. If you choose to debone this, which I suggest for freezer space, that is one thing that's probably an issue when it comes to larger bone sizes, is going to be space in the freezer. You can debone this, and so pull the tenderloin off the top. Go ahead and remove the bone with, I suggest a bandsaw is the easiest way to do it, but if you don't have access to that, you can debone with a knife. It'll just take you a hot second. And so go ahead and remove that. Pull the tenderloin. You can turn it into a tenderloin roast and leave it whole, or you can turn it into tenderloin steaks. And so I suggest to cut those at least 1.5 inches thick. And then you can go ahead and take the bottom portion of this muscle, which is a stripling, and go ahead and cut that into 1 inch or 1.5 inch steaks as well. I suggest generally to leave porterhouses and strip loins, depending on how big your animal is. I tend to leave those at about an inch. Otherwise, depending on the size and the muscularity of that carcass, you might have them too big in terms of that. Out of the sirloin, there are a couple really good cuts that kind of hide up in here that are my suggestions. Um, they're all right here. The sirloin ball tip roast before we really get into the steaks. If you are interested in drying product and doing jerky and things like that, that is always my suggestion. There, this is a really lean cut that holds up well to drying. But then we also have the top sirloin steak, the tri-tip, which is a muscle that helps the animal lift up its hind leg. There are two in every carcass, and I highly suggest that one, as well as the culotte roast. If you've ever had a picanha from a Brazilian steakhouse or something like that, um, sometimes you can get them at retail. It's hard to find them at retail, but it's really nice and tender if it's cooked low and slow. If you're a big fan of smoking, I highly recommend that one. The round, when it comes to at-home processing, the round is generally a little bit more trouble than it's worth to leave in whole cuts. You can fabricate it into steaks and separate it into the top round, bottom round, and eye round. However, it's really successful as ground beef and it helps improve your lean point if that is what you're after. And so you can fabricate into the top round steak, the bottom round steak, or I also suggest the bottom round being fabricated into bottom round rump roasts. Those are really great in a crock pot. They have a little bit more marbling than some of our top rounds. And then the eye round, I generally see it performing the best if it's been turned into cube steaks and then turned into like a chicken fried steak or something like that. It helps add value into it. It's one that looks like a tenderloin again, but it is tough and dry if you do cook it like a traditional steak. So if you aren't going to turn it into ground beef, I would leave that as a roast and cook it that way. And so you can also make cube steaks. I always suggest beef for stew and beef for stir fry. They're really easy to pull out in terms of cuts and things like that. And then also ground beef as well. And then I have breakdowns for all of these. And again, I'll send my slides to Chris and Jason so you guys have access to this, but we're going to kind of rapid dash through pork and beef and poultry to kind of finish this up. And so pork, again, we have multiple ways to break this down in terms of this. And so generally, when we come to the shoulder, we can go ahead and separate the Boston butt from the arm picnic, and then you can make blade and arm steaks out of those. Those are really successful in a crock pot as well. If you cook them traditionally as a steak, because of the extra connective tissue that's in the shoulder, they can shorten up and get pretty tough in terms of that. The loin, this is where all of our chops come from. Blade, rib, loin, sirloin, they all come from the loin. And so depending on what portion of the loin that we're pulling those from, that's where we're going to start to see changes there. And you can see changes in terms of the muscle as we move through the loin when we look at this. And so we're going to have more of the larger blade muscles coming out of the blade end, and then really nice chops out of the center rib and center loin, and then the sirloin end here. We can also pull out the whole pork tenderloin too. And those are also really good if you're looking for a nice lean cut of pork. So we can cut and fabricate these chops multiple different ways depending on what we're looking at. And we can also pull back ribs out of the top part of a center loin as well. The belly is pretty simple. You can cure it and slice it, or you can slice it and then cure it. Well, generally we're gonna cure it first before we slice it. And this requires a smokehouse to do, or some form of cooking step for this to happen. And we can also pull spare ribs off the top of the belly, which is also a very popular cut to barbecue. Hams, depending on how you want to process this smoked ham boneless, this is not a great example of a fabricated cut. This is from tumbling and massaging and some other processing steps here, but you can get a fresh ham that you can turn into a smoked ham or smoked center slices. Pork jerky, I have people that ask me about that, and that would be from the tip roast as well. It's a great muscle out of the hindquarters that just holds up really well to dehydrating steps when it comes to jerky. And of course, with various parts of the pork carcass, you can turn that into ground beef or sausage, depending on how you want to do that. If you have chops from across the carcass, you can also turn those into country style ribs as well, and give that an option as well. Lamb carcass, this is probably one of the more simple ones. Out of the shoulder and the breast, we can do very similar cuts to what we've already pulled out of a pork carcass or a beef carcass, but they're just going to be a lot smaller. You can also pull Denver style ribs out of these, and so these are really great, again, cooked low and slow or smoked on a smoker. Apologize for that, that got out of order. When it comes to the rib, this is very similar to what we see with beef. You get a rib roast or you get rib chops. And you can do those a couple of different ways. I suggest to just leave them plain. Don't get fancy with the Frenched if you don't have to. But you can also make a crown roast as well if you're looking for something um, for a special occasion. The loin, we're pretty much going to get loin chops. You can cut it into a double loin and leave that loin whole as well. Those look pretty cool. And most people are going to eat more than just one lamb chop. And so it makes it easier for serving purposes and storage purposes. They stack a little bit better, in comparison to those. The leg, I just suggest to leave whole, or if you don't want to do that, you can separate them into sirloin chops and center slices. Those are going to freeze a little bit better and they're going to take up less freezer space than a whole leg. Um, One thing though with the lamb in comparison to beef and pork, the lamb shanks actually do taste good if they are cooked correctly. They're not as tough because they're not as old as some of our other species when we harvest them. And they're generally a little bit fatter. And so I suggest leaving the shanks separate, and cooking those. Uh, I know I keep saying it, but low and slow is the best way to cook those lamb shanks. But probably the simplest of all is poultry. And so we can break a poultry carcass into our four major cuts. And so it winds up being eight total. You can cut it into the breast, the drumsticks, the thigh, and the wing. You can also leave it as a whole bird. A lot of people, if they want to sell chickens and things like that, leave it as a whole bird. It's a lot easier to do that. If you're looking to save freezer space, you may break those down ahead of time, in terms of that as well. And so when we think about the white meat, if we want to further break down this poultry carcass, especially chicken carcasses, we can break those down into three separate parts. If you want to break your wing down, the wing tips, the wingette, and the wing drumette. If you guys were eating wings for the Super Bowl, most of the time they're going to be the winglet and the drumstick. Wing tips, they're just very bony, and really hard to get meat off of. For the breasts, you can either leave it whole or you can pull tenderloins out, depending on how you want to portion them. Tenderloins are great if your family likes a lot of chicken tenders and things like that. They're really easy to pull out, and just go ahead and bread and fry those when you're ready to do that. For dark meat, generally we're going to take that leg and we're going to break it down into two major portions. One, of course, is the famous drumstick. You can go ahead and do that. Or you can go ahead, you can leave the legs whole. And generally we see quite a bit of that at retail, because then you can break them down and cook them however you want to, but you can separate them, at that joint um, between a drumstick and a boneless thigh. And so you can leave the drumsticks bone in. If you decide to bone those out, it's better for ground chicken at that point. But the boneless thigh really is pretty easy because that muscle is wrapped around that femur bone and it makes it pretty easy to pull off. And one of my suggestions is cooking with thigh meat. It's a lot more tender and flavorful than some of our breast meat. And it holds up a lot better in things that you need a lot stronger flavor for. And so finally tonight, I'm going to wrap up with storage and preservation, because Now you have this meat. What the heck are you going to do with it? Well, I have a couple suggestions for you. And so when we talk about storage and preservation, of course, we have some what I like to call, well, duh methods. And so freezing, refrigeration, those are slam dunks. Everybody knows about those. And so what we're trying to do with the other methods of dehydration, curing, or pickling, canning is what we're trying to accomplish is preservation. And so we want to restrict any changes that are going to make bad changes. So spoilage, oxidation, those are going to be our major ones when we talk about that. And so when it comes to refrigeration storage, we're pretty limited in terms of this unless you seal it in a vacuum sealer. That is one of my suggestions is some form of food saver, or some form of vacuum sealer at home because that is the best way we can store product. That extends the shelf life significantly. Doesn't matter if we're refrigerating it, freezing it, drying it. Um, if you look at product in the stores like beef jerky or Slim Jims and things like that, they're always vacuum sealed, and then they have an oxygen scavenger on top of that to keep oxygen out because it contributes to so many issues when we talk about preserving product. And so we have a couple of different things that can impact that initial microbial load. That's why it's important to keep things clean and safe when we're going through those harvest steps. Temperature and humidity conditions of storage, so making sure that your product stays cold and it's not in a very humid environment. The species is also going to impact that. Poultry generally has a lower shelf life in comparison to our red meat species. The type of product, is it whole, ground, cooked? Those all impact the length of storage and the type of packaging. If you can at least get it in a vacuum, in a Ziploc freezer bag, that's going to put you so much further ahead than just a plain old plastic bag. Vacuum sealing, again, is going to be your best bet. If you have product in your home refrigerator, you should have that consumed within 4 days because of microbial concerns. But if you do have certain types of packaging, so vacuum packaged or vacuum packaged cured product, you're going to have a lot longer shelf life when it comes to that. But if you have the oxygen permeable packaging, so if you have it wrapped in saran wrap, if you have it in plastic bags that are just tied off with a twist tie, those are all going to really reduce your ability to store that product. And so when taking care of storage, we want to make sure that our packaging doesn't allow for any microbial contamination, doesn't import any weird odors or weird flavors. Everybody's had that thing that you pull out of the fridge and you're like, well, payday's not for another couple days. And then you taste it and you're like, this tastes like all the flavors of my refrigerator. Um, it happens. There's not a lot of that has to do with the packaging type and how long it's been in there. Um, you want it to be stiff enough and have enough strength to hold on as it goes through the freezer, especially if you're one that kind of digs through the freezers when it comes to that, and grease proof as well, because we do have fat. Fat is a part of life when it comes to meat processing. In my professional opinion, vacuum sealing is the best combination that you're going to get. It's going to extend your shelf life, it's going to make sure your quality is extended, and it's going to reduce oxidation so you have better product quality and product safety. And so we know that freezing, this is not news to anybody, freezing is the best way to store product for extended periods. Besides drying and dehydration and other options like that, basically it helps maintain nutrition and things like that. And so it also doesn't impact color as long as it's stored correctly. And so the quality and things like this are basically how long we freeze it, how long it's been stored, how fast do you freeze it. The faster you freeze it, the better the quality is going to hold. Um, One big thing is storage condition, especially temperature variations. I love it when people have a chest freezer. I have one myself, but if you have your chest freezer, do not put it on a porch that is either on an east facing or west facing scenario. And the reason that I say that is when the sun sets or the sun comes up in the morning, it reflects directly on that freezer and it forces it to work harder. And so you can have more fluctuations in terms of temperature, which impacts your overall shelf life. Um, I've had many people call me with questions about that. And so that is always one of my big suggestions. Keep it in a shady area so it doesn't have to work as hard. So if that's the garage, if that's the basement, um, anything like that is much better than being on a porch on either one of those directions. And so we have these issues that can impact this. Just a couple more examples here. But one of the big questions that we have here is freezer storage. Um, I have um, examples when it comes to this, and so this is just general rule of thumb when it comes to measuring this. So if you're looking for beef, you're going to need at least 40 cubic feet for a whole beef, and then going down depending on how much beef you have. And so it really depends on that. Most chest freezers are going to have about 30 cubic feet, so you may need multiple. Lamb, you can get away with about 2 to 4 cubic feet. Half a pork, 3 to 5 cubic feet of freezer space. And then depending on how big your whole pork, again, this depends on carcass size, about 7 to 10 cubic feet. For poultry, it depends on the birds. When it comes to that size, if you're doing chickens or turkeys, um, if you're doing hens of some sort, like those little Cornish game hens, you can fit a lot more of those in the freezer depending on what you're working with. Okay. One thing with poultry, you may see bone darkening, and this is one of the conditions that I just want to touch on really quick. Basically, it starts to appear red after freezing and thawing. And so this turns to black during cooking, and I just want to let you guys know not to be alarmed. It doesn't impact the flavor or the taste or the palatability of that product. It's just darker in color, and it just kind of looks a little unappealing. And the last thing that I'm going to kind of wind up on tonight is dehydration, because I do get questions about this quite a bit in terms of this. And so basically what we're doing during dehydration steps is reducing the water activity. And so that's on a cellular, molecular level, how much water is available to participate in reactions. And so in the case of meat, we have a really high water activity because meat is 70 to 75% water. And so microbes love it. That's one of the problems that we struggle with in the meat industry is that high water activity. If we're working with like flour or something like that that has a really low water activity, they don't have near the microbe issues that we have in the meat industry. And so basically, we can do this a couple of different ways. We can do hot air drying, which is an example here. You can also do freeze drying as well. Um, and so, just depending on what equipment you have, the hot air drying is probably the easiest and the most accessible in terms of that. And so, I am more than happy to share more information on dehydration as well, but I did want to touch on that tonight. And so, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. This is my contact information. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out via email or my cell phone number. I do have an office phone, but I almost never pick it up because they're always calling me about my car's extended warranty that does not exist with my office number. I did not purchase a vehicle with my office number, but definitely email, cell phone number with that as well. And I did see we had a question in the chat that I'm going to go ahead and answer.